St. Martin's General Hospital, a top-notch facility nestled in a wealthy suburb, was about to face an unexpected test. When Michelle Garcia, a skilled African-American nurse, joined their team, she had no idea of the ingrained biases she'd soon be up against. As tensions rose and conflicts grew, a patient named Wilson Browns quietly observed everything from his hospital bed. But Mr. Brown was no ordinary patient, and his presence was about to shake things up. What hidden influence did this mysterious man hold? And how could Michelle's struggles spark change within the hospital? Stay tuned. Before we jump in, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe if you love stories with surprising turns and moments of justice. The spotless halls of St. Martin's glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights as Michelle Garcia entered for the first time. The sharp smell of disinfectant hung in the air, and something else, an undercurrent of unease, made her stomach turn. She was nervous, but Michelle stood tall, determined to start off on the right foot. Approaching the nurses' station, she noticed the sudden hush that swept over the area. Conversations faded into whispers, and the nurses avoided her gaze as if making eye contact was something to be feared. Michelle swallowed, pushing down the familiar wave of loneliness she had learned to manage. "Excuse me," Michelle said, keeping her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm Michelle Garcia, the new nurse. Could you point me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse glanced up, her blue eyes widening for a brief moment before she flashed a polite but distant smile. "Sure," she said coolly. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Michelle nodded and headed down the corridor, feeling the weight of curious eyes on her back. The sound of her sensible shoes clicking against the polished floor echoed louder than usual in the unnaturally quiet space. As she neared the office, a tall, sharp-looking man in a white coat stepped out of a room nearby. His salt-and-pepper hair and commanding presence made it clear he was someone important. Michelle's heart lifted slightly. Maybe this was her chance to make a good impression. "Good morning, Doctor," Michelle said, giving a warm smile. "I'm Michelle Garcia, the new nurse. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor's grey eyes swept over her without much interest. "Dr. Ethan Johnson," he said curtly. "I trust you've been properly introduced to our procedures." Before Michelle could say anything, Dr. Johnson continued, "We uphold very high standards here at St. Martin's. I hope you're ready to meet them." Without waiting for a response, he brushed past her, leaving Michelle standing there with her hand awkwardly dropping to her side. His words stung, but she wasn't about to let them crush her spirit. Taking a deep breath, Michelle straightened her posture, knocked on the head nurse's door, and waited for a response. Her mind drifted back to her days in nursing school, and her mother's words echoed in her memory. "Baby girl," her mother had said with a mix of pride and caution. "You're going to have to work twice as hard as anyone else, but never let them see you break. You come from a long line of strong women, and that strength runs in you, too." Michelle remembered those late nights poring over textbooks, the extra shifts in the lab, and that constant gnawing feeling of needing to prove herself. She recalled the subtle dismissals from professors, the surprise on their faces when she aced her exams, and the whispers from classmates who doubted if she really belonged. But despite everything, Michelle had pushed through, determined to succeed. Michelle had graduated at the very top of her class, her grit and talent shutting down even the harshest doubters. Now, standing in the halls of St. Martin's, she pulled strength from those memories. She'd faced challenges before, and she knew she could do it again. The door swung open, and a stern-looking woman, probably in her mid-40s, stood before her. "Miss Garcia, right?" she said, her voice short and to the point. "Come in. We've got a lot to go over, and I expect you to keep up." As Michelle followed the head nurse into the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into more than just a new job. The hospital felt tense, like something unspoken was simmering beneath the surface, hiding behind professional smiles and the neat, sterile atmosphere. Little did she realize her presence would soon shake up St. Martin's, stirring the pot and bringing long-buried issues to light, challenging the toxic environment that lurked beneath its respected image. The rest of Michelle's first day sped by in a blur of meetings, introductions, and endless paperwork. As she walked through the hospital halls, though, she started to notice something unsettling. Conversations would suddenly go quiet when she got close, only to pick back up in hushed whispers after she passed. Her attempts to chat with the other nurses were met with polite but distant responses, leaving her feeling out of place in a setting that should have been about teamwork. By the end of her shift, Michelle was completely drained, both mentally and emotionally. As she grabbed her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses chatting quietly just around the corner. "Did you see the new girl?" one of them whispered. "Yeah," the other one replied. "Not sure what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the place for, well, you know." Michelle's hand froze on the locker door, her heart sinking. She'd hoped the coldness was just part of the usual first-day awkwardness, but now it was all too clear. This wasn't just a new job, it was going to be a constant battle against prejudice and assumptions. Walking out of the hospital, Michelle felt the weight of the day pushing down on her. She headed to the bus stop, her mind swirling with doubt and frustration. The excitement she'd felt earlier that morning had given way to a heavy sense of isolation. Sitting down on the hard bench at the stop, she pulled out her phone and called a number she knew by heart. After a couple of rings, the familiar, soothing voice of her mother answered. "Hey, baby girl, how'd your first day go?" The sound of her mom's voice hit Michelle hard, and she felt tears sting her eyes. She took a deep breath, determined not to cry in public. "It was tough, Mama," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, then her mum spoke again, her tone strong but full of understanding. "Michelle Marie Garcia, you hear me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel small. You remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of being where you are someday." Michelle closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her. "I know, Mama. It's just, I didn't think it'd be this hard." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, honey," her mum said. "But you've got generations of strength behind you. Keep your head up, do your job better than anyone, and don't you ever let them see you sweat. Got it?" "Yes, Mama," Michelle answered, feeling a new sense of determination. "I hear you." As she hung up the phone, Michelle noticed a sleek black Mercedes slow down at the bus stop. Through the tinted windows, she caught a quick glimpse of Dr. Johnson, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before the car drove off. Michelle straightened her shoulders, her mum's words replaying in her mind. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't alone. With her family's strength behind her and her own will to succeed, Michelle felt ready for whatever St. Martin's would throw her way. As the bus pulled up, Michelle stood tall, prepared for another day at work. She had no idea that her presence at St. Martin's was about to set off a chain reaction that would shake the hospital to its core, revealing deep-seated biases and bringing long-overdue change. In the weeks that followed, the tension at St. Martin's General Hospital grew steadily, like a slow fuse burning. What had started as subtle coldness on her first day had turned into a more calculated form of exclusion, hard to prove, but impossible to miss. As Michelle made her rounds, she couldn't ignore how differently she was treated compared to her white co-workers. Dr. Ethan Johnson, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in criticizing her, no matter how carefully she did her job. "Nurse Garcia," Dr. Johnson called out one morning across the busy nurses' station. "I hope by now you're familiar with our protocols. We can't afford any mistakes." He put extra emphasis on the word, sending a shiver down Michelle's spine. She met his eyes, refusing to back down. "Of course, Dr. Johnson. I'm fully up to speed on all hospital procedures," she replied calmly. Dr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see about that. Let's hope you've learned everything you need here." His patronizing tone wasn't lost on Michelle or the other nurses, who pretended to be busy but were clearly listening in. As Dr. Johnson walked away, Michelle could feel the unspoken judgment of her colleagues weighing on her. Throughout the day, Michelle found herself being assigned the hardest tasks. While her white co-workers handled simpler cases, she was repeatedly given the most difficult patients and complex procedures. "Michelle, could you take Mr. Johnson in room 305? A fellow nurse asked in a sugary sweet voice. "He's been a bit challenging today." Michelle nodded, knowing full well that challenging was putting it lightly. Mr. Johnson was notorious for his racist outbursts and had already made 2 nurses cry that week. Still, Michelle approached the situation with professionalism, determined to prove herself. As she entered Mr. Johnson's room, bracing for his inevitable tirade, she couldn't help but wonder if this was another test of her endurance, or worse, an attempt to set her up to fail. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson spat the moment he saw her. "I told them I didn't want any colored nurse touching me." Michelle took a deep breath, steadying herself against the barrage of hateful words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you I'm more than qualified to take care of you." She worked quickly and efficiently, ignoring the constant stream of slurs and insults. Michelle maintained her professionalism, completing her tasks with precision, refusing to let Mr. Johnson's bigotry affect her work. When she finally stepped out of the room, Dr. Johnson was waiting in the hallway, a fake look of concern on his face. "Everything okay in there, Nurse Garcia? We heard quite a bit of noise." Michelle met his gaze, her voice steady. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are fine and his dressing is changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Johnson?" For a split second, surprise flashed across his face before his usual condescending expression returned. "Well, let's hope you can keep up that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints, now would we?" As Dr. Johnson walked off, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been tested in a way she never should have been. The rest of her shift felt like a blur, full of tasks piling up and small, subtle jabs. She found herself double-checking everything, not because she doubted her skills, but because she knew any small mistake would be blown out of proportion and held against her. As the hours dragged on, Michelle noticed how her white colleagues seemed to cruise through their shifts, laughing and chatting while she struggled under a heavy workload. The unfairness was painfully obvious, but every time she thought about speaking up, her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." By the end of her shift, Michelle was utterly drained, physically and emotionally. As she gathered her belongings from her locker, she overheard 2 nurses talking in hushed voices nearby. "Can you believe all this fuss over diversity hires?" one said, her tone laced with disdain. "They can't keep up with the rest of us anyway," the other replied smugly. Michelle's hand froze on her locker. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment she wanted to confront them, to defend herself. But she knew it would only fuel their biases, so instead she quietly closed her locker, held her head high, and made her way out of the hospital. At the bus stop, Michelle waited, lost in thought. That same sleek black Mercedes she'd seen earlier pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and there was Dr. Johnson behind the wheel. "Nurse Garcia!" he called out, pretending to sound concerned. Waiting for the bus again? What a shame. Guess that's what a nurse's salary gets you, huh? Before Michelle could respond, he sped off, leaving her standing there, anger and humiliation boiling inside her. His casual cruelty cut deep, a reminder of the uphill fight she faced every day at St. Martin's. As she boarded the bus, her mind swirled with frustration. The excitement and hope she once had when she started at St. Martin's now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a cold determination to just get through the day in such a toxic place. But even as her thoughts raced, a quiet voice in the back of her mind told her that something had to change. The question was, would she crumble under the pressure, or would her persistence finally break the cycle? Little did Michelle know, someone unexpected was about to come into her life, someone who would help turn things around and expose the deep-rooted issues lurking in the halls of St. Martin's General Hospital. As the bus rolled through the dark streets, Michelle closed her eyes, pulling strength from her mother's words and the resilience that flowed through her veins. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was ready to face it head-on, no matter what came her way. The next morning, Michelle arrived at St. Martin's with renewed determination. After a long night of reflection, she reminded herself why she became a nurse in the first place: to help people, no matter the circumstances or her own challenges. As she headed to the nurses' station, she noticed a sense of urgency in the air. Nurses were rushing around, prepping a room with a level of excitement she hadn't seen before. Michelle asked one of her co-workers, her curiosity piqued. Momentarily dropping her usual cold attitude toward Michelle, the nurse responded with excitement, "We've got a VIP coming in. Some big shot who had a skiing accident. Both arms are broken from what I hear." Before Michelle could ask more, Dr. Johnson appeared with a stern look on his face. "Nurse Garcia," he said, his tone sharp, "I need you to take care of the new admission in room 412. Wilson Brown's. He's had a serious skiing accident. Both arms are broken. Make sure he gets the best care." Michelle nodded, recognizing it for what it was, another test. "Of course, Dr. Johnson. I'll handle it right away." As Michelle walked down the hall towards room 412, she couldn't shake the feeling that this task was somehow different from the others. Something about the patient felt important, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this situation than it appeared. When she stepped into the room, she was met by the sight of a man in his 50s lying in bed, both arms in casts. Despite his injuries, there was a quiet authority about him that Michelle picked up on immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Brown," she said, approaching the bed with a friendly smile. "I'm Nurse Michelle Garcia, and I'll be looking after you while you're with us." Mr. Brown glanced up at her, his eyes sharp and observant. "Good morning, Nurse Garcia," he responded, his voice stronger than she expected. "Thanks for your help. I didn't think I'd end up here after a skiing accident of all things." As Michelle began to check his vitals, she noticed how intently Mr. Brown was watching her. There was no sign of condescension or judgment in his gaze, just genuine curiosity. "You seem very capable, Nurse Garcia," Mr. Brown remarked as she adjusted his IV. "How long have you been at St. Martin's?" Michelle paused, surprised by the sincerity in his question. "I've been here a few weeks now," she replied cautiously. "It's been a learning experience for sure." Mr. Brown raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement crossing his face. "I see," he said, his tone teasing. "And how's the hospital? Living up to its big reputation, I hope." Before Michelle could respond, Dr. Johnson breezed into the room, overly cheerful in a way Michelle had never seen before. "Mr. Brown!" Dr. Johnson exclaimed, his voice filled with exaggerated warmth. "I trust Nurse Garcia is taking excellent care of you. We always assign our top staff to our most important patients." Michelle fought to keep her expression neutral, knowing full well that Dr. Johnson had never shown this much confidence in her before. Mr. Brown seemed to catch the odd change in tone as well. "Yes, Doctor," Mr. Brown said, his eyes flicking between Michelle and Dr. Johnson. "Nurse Garcia has been excellent. I was just asking her about her time here at St. Martin's." Dr. Johnson's smile faltered slightly before quickly recovering. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been a fantastic experience. We pride ourselves on having a supportive and inclusive environment here." Michelle felt a wave of frustration at Dr. Johnson's blatant hypocrisy, but she kept her professional demeanor. Mr. Brown, however, seemed to sense the tension. "Is that so?" he murmured, his gaze never leaving Michelle. "I'm looking forward to experiencing this supportive environment myself during my stay." Dr. Johnson immediately launched into a lengthy explanation of Mr. Brown's treatment plan. But Michelle couldn't help feeling like she had just witnessed something important. The way Mr. Brown had looked at her, the way he asked his questions, it was almost as if he saw through the glossy image St. Martin's tried to project. In the following days, Michelle found herself spending more time with Mr. Brown than any other patient. Despite his injuries, he was alert and engaging, frequently asking about her work and background. Unlike many patients and staff, Mr. Brown seemed genuinely interested in her answers, never showing any of the prejudice she had unfortunately become used to. One afternoon, while Michelle was changing Mr. Brown bandages, a conversation outside the room made her freeze. "I don't care what Dr. Johnson says," came a sharp voice from a nurse. "I don't trust that Garcia woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she's capable of?" "I know," another voice chimed in, "but we can't say anything. They'll just call us racists." Michelle's hands trembled as she finished the bandaging, the weight of their suspicions pressing down on her. Mr. Brown, ever perceptive, noticed. "Everything okay, Nurse Garcia?" he asked gently, his tone filled with concern. Forcing a smile, Michelle replied, "Of course, Mr. Brown. Just making sure these bandages are perfect." He was quiet for a moment, studying her closely. "You know," he eventually said, "I've always believed that a person's true character shows in how they treat those they think are beneath them, not just their bosses." Michelle looked up, surprised by his pointed remark. Mr. Brown held her gaze with a knowing look. "I've seen a lot from this bed, Nurse Garcia, and let me tell you, it's been eye-opening." Before Michelle could reply, Dr. Johnson walked in, ending the conversation abruptly. As she left the room, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Brown was more than just a regular patient. His words hinted that he understood the deeper issues at play at St. Martin's. For the first time since she started working there, Michelle felt a spark of hope. What Michelle didn't know was that Mr. Brown's presence would set off a series of events that would expose the deep-rooted prejudices hiding behind the hospital's polished reputation. Over the following days, Michelle found herself more and more isolated at St. Martin's. What had started as coldness from her co-workers had now turned into open hostility. She faced whispered insults and icy stares everywhere she went. Dr. Johnson, feeling unchecked in his actions, became even bolder in undermining her. One morning, while Michelle was reviewing patient charts at the nurses' station, Dr. Johnson approached her with a towering stack of files. "Nurse Garcia," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly difficult. Think you can manage?" Michelle glanced at the files, immediately realizing it was twice the workload of her peers. Meeting his gaze without flinching, she simply nodded. As Dr. Johnson walked away, a smirk on his face, she overheard him mutter, "Let's see how she handles this." Throughout the day, Michelle was running from one tough case to the next, barely catching her breath. The patients she was assigned were among the most difficult in the hospital, many with complicated medical conditions or difficult personalities. Even as exhaustion set in, Michelle refused to lower her standards, treating each patient with the same care and professionalism. But the constant pressure was wearing her down, both physically and emotionally. While responding to yet another patient call, Michelle overheard two nurses talking nearby. Can you believe they've got her handling all these critical cases? One nurse whispered, her voice full of scorn. It's like they're just waiting for her to screw up. I know, the other nurse replied, but you have to admit it's impressive how she's still going. I would have cracked by now. Hurt and anger washed over Michelle. The realization that her colleagues not only knew about the unfair treatment, but were actually watching to see if she would fail was almost too much to bear. As the day dragged on, Michelle found herself stopping by Mr. Brown's room more often. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become her little escape, a place where she could take a breath and feel like someone truly valued her. Good to see you, Nurse Garcia. Mr. Brown greeted her as she entered for a routine check. You look wiped out. Everything okay? Michelle forced a tired smile. Just a busy day, Mr. Brown. Nothing I can't handle. Mr. Brown studied her face, concern evident in his eyes. You know, he said slowly, there's a difference between just getting through something and really thriving. From what I've seen, you're capable of much more. His kind words only made the contrast between his care and how the rest of the hospital treated her more glaring. Michelle felt a lump form in her throat, her loneliness creeping in. Thank you, Mr. Brown, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I appreciate your kindness. As she turned to leave, he called after her. Nurse Garcia. His voice had a quiet authority that made her stop. Remember, sometimes real strength comes from knowing when to speak up. She left his room, her mind racing with the weight of his words. As she headed back to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. Little did she know, the next day would test her in ways she never expected, and push her to confront what had been simmering since her first day at St. Martin's. The following morning, Michelle walked into a hospital buzzing with heightened activity. Rumors spread about a high-stakes emergency surgery scheduled for later, with several board members and important guests coming to watch. As she began her rounds, she felt the nervous energy in the air. Everyone, from nurses to doctors, seemed tense, the weight of the upcoming procedure heavy on their minds. Midway through her shift, Dr. Johnson approached her, a certain gleam in his eye that immediately put her on edge. Nurse Garcia, he said in a flat tone, we need you to assist in the emergency operation this afternoon. It's critical. I trust you're ready. Surprise and suspicion washed over Michelle. Being asked to assist in such a high-profile operation was usually an honor, but coming from Dr. Johnson, she couldn't help but question his motives. Of course, Dr. Johnson, she replied, keeping her voice calm. I'll be prepared. As Dr. Johnson walked away, she overheard him muttering to another doctor, let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting. The hours leading up to the surgery were a blur of preparation. Michelle threw herself into the work, checking everything twice, then a third time, making sure she was ready for any challenges the operation might throw her way. As she scrubbed in, she noticed the skeptical glances from some of the other staff members. She took a deep breath, mentally repeating her mother's words. Don't you dare let them see you stumble. The operation started, and Michelle found herself side by side with Dr. Johnson and other senior staff. The tension in the room was thick, especially with the knowledge that important eyes were watching every move. But despite the pressure, Michelle stayed focused, her hands steady, her timing perfect. She knew what the surgeons needed before they even asked, her years of training kicking in. As the surgery went on, Michelle noticed something that made her heart race. Dr. Johnson, usually so confident, hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared for a critical incision. In that split second, Michelle realized he was about to make a dangerous mistake. Without a second thought, she spoke up. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice steady and clear, "maybe we should consider another angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it could be safer." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Michelle. Dr. Johnson stared at her, surprise and a flicker of anger crossing his face. For a moment, she thought he'd ignore her. But then, almost too subtle to notice, he nodded. He adjusted his approach, following her suggestion. As the surgery progressed, it became evident that her actions had likely saved the patient's life. Michelle could feel the weight of several eyes on her. Some stared with newfound respect, while others, especially Dr. Johnson, seemed to barely suppress their anger. When it was time to clean up, Dr. Johnson shot a glare at her. "Nurse Garcia, I need to see you in private right now," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Michelle followed him out of the operating room, her heart pounding. She knew speaking up had been the right choice, but she feared it might cost her the job. As they stepped into a room, she realized it was Mr. Brown's room. She'd forgotten he was still a patient at the hospital. Dr. Johnson, however, didn't seem to care. As soon as the door shut, he whirled on Michelle, his face flushed with anger. "How dare you question me in front of everyone?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Do you even understand who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for your insubordination." Michelle stood her ground, keeping her voice steady. "Dr. Johnson, I was just doing my job. The patient's safety—" "Your job," he interrupted, raising his voice. "Your job is to follow orders, not to act like you know more than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious place like St. Martin's. You're here because of some diversity quota, not because of any real skill or talent." As Dr. Johnson ranted, his words became more openly racist, and Michelle felt a wave of anger and hopelessness wash over her. The small slights she'd endured seemed like nothing compared to this. But just as she was about to respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Johnson," came the calm yet commanding voice of Mr. Brown. "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Michelle and Dr. Johnson turned, stunned to see Mr. Brown sitting up in bed, a look of controlled fury on his face. "Mr. Brown," Dr. Johnson stuttered, his face paling, "I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for the disturbance." "Oh, I've been awake, Dr. Johnson," Mr. Brown replied, his eyes narrowing. "Long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others have been treating Nurse Garcia." Michelle stood frozen, hardly believing what she was hearing. The quiet, unassuming patient now seemed to radiate power and authority that filled the room. "Mr. Brown," Dr. Johnson began, his voice faltering, "this is all a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Mr. Brown cut him off sharply. "What I've seen during my stay here is a pattern of discrimination, and it stops now." As he spoke, both Michelle and Dr. Johnson realized that Mr. Brown was far more than just a VIP patient. The way he carried himself, the weight in his words, it was clear he wielded significant influence. Who are you?" Dr. Johnson asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Mr. Brown smiled, but it lacked any warmth. "I'm someone with the power to influence this hospital's future. And right now, Dr. Johnson, I'm not inclined to support an institution that tolerates blatant racism and unprofessionalism." As the gravity of the situation set in, Michelle felt a mix of emotions. Relief that someone had finally witnessed the treatment she'd endured, anger at the injustice, and for the first time in a long while, a flicker of hope that things might change. None of them had any idea that this confrontation was about to kick off a chain of events that would shake St. Martin's General Hospital to its core, uncovering long-hidden biases and pushing the hospital towards a long-overdue reckoning. The tension in Mr. Brown's room was almost unbearable as his words hit home. Michelle stood quietly, her thoughts spinning from the unexpected turn of events. Mr. Brown, now sitting up fully in bed, locked eyes with Dr. Johnson. "I think it's time we have an honest conversation about the culture of this hospital, don't you?" he said. Before Dr. Johnson could answer, there was a knock on the door. A nervous-looking nurse peeked in. "Dr. Johnson, the hospital administrator is looking for you. It's urgent." Dr. Johnson glanced back and forth between Mr. Brown and the nurse, clearly conflicted. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "We'll continue this conversation later, Mr. Brown. Nurse Garcia, you're dismissed for now." As Dr. Johnson hurried out, Michelle found herself alone with Mr. Brown. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. "Nurse Garcia," Mr. Brown finally said, his voice much softer now, "I think it's time I properly introduce myself. My name is Wilson Browns, and I'm the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare networks in the country." Michelle's eyes widened in disbelief. Healthcare United was a major player in the medical industry, known for its power and influence. Suddenly, Mr. Brown's earlier comments about having the authority to make or break the hospital made perfect sense. "Mr. Brown, Michelle started, not quite sure what to say. "Please sit down," Mr. Brown said, motioning to a chair by his bed. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Over the next hour, Mr. Brown shared how his stay at St. Martin's had been an eye-opener, even though it was unplanned due to his skiing accident. "I came here expecting just standard medical care," Mr. Brown explained. "But instead, I've seen a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that goes against everything I stand for as a healthcare leader." He went on to describe how he had noticed both the subtle and blatant discrimination Michelle had experienced, along with the toxic environment that seemed to run through the hospital. "Your experience, Nurse Garcia, sadly isn't unique," Mr. Brown said, a mix of frustration and resolve in his voice. "But it's unacceptable, and it ends now." As they continued talking, Michelle felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time since working at St. Martin's, she felt truly heard. Mr. Brown listened closely as she recounted her struggles, his face becoming more serious with each story. He agreed that systemic change, not just individual effort, was needed. Just then, there was another knock at the door. The hospital administrator entered, looking frazzled. "Mr. Brown," she said, her voice shaking a little, "I understand there are concerns about our hospital's practices. I want to assure you we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Brown raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" he asked. "Because, from what I've seen, the only thing taken seriously here is keeping an outdated and discriminatory system in place." The administrator's face turned pale, clearly not expecting such blunt criticism. I'm not sure I follow. We have diversity programs in place." "Initiatives aren't enough," Mr. Brown cut her off. "What you need is a complete overhaul of your hospital's culture, and that starts at the top." Over the next few hours, Mr. Brown laid out his vision for change. He called for a full investigation into the hospital's discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a total rework of the hospital's hiring and promotion policies. "Dr. Johnson will be thoroughly investigated," Mr. Brown said, his voice firm. His actions today were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory and could have endangered patient care. The hospital administrator, realizing the severity of the situation, nodded in silent agreement. The air in St. Martin's Hospital was charged with tension, fear, anticipation, and for some, a glimmer of hope. Michelle, still trying to process everything that had just happened, found herself the center of attention. Colleagues who had previously ignored or treated her poorly now approached her, offering clumsy apologies or asking her opinion on the upcoming changes. At the end of her shift, Michelle decided to visit Mr. Brown's room one last time. When she entered, he was sitting up in bed, looking tired but content. "Nurse Garcia," he greeted her warmly, "I hope you don't mind, but I've recommended you for a spot on the new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experiences and insights are going to be crucial as we work on transforming St. Martin's." Michelle felt a wave of emotion, gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Brown," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Brown shook his head. "No, Nurse Garcia, thank you. Your bravery and professionalism in the face of adversity have been truly inspiring. You've reminded me why I got into healthcare in the first place, to make a real difference." As Michelle walked out of the hospital that evening, she couldn't help but feel like a new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for St. Martin's. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since starting at the hospital, she felt genuinely optimistic. What she didn't realize was that the changes set in motion that day would ripple far beyond the walls of St. Martin's, impacting the entire healthcare system. The next few days were a whirlwind at St. Martin's General Hospital. News of Mr. Brown's identity and his demands for change sent shockwaves through the institution. The hospital's pristine image had been shattered, exposing deep-rooted problems that had been ignored for too long. On Monday morning, Michelle arrived to find news trucks parked outside the hospital, reporters swarming for statements. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with staff members whispering in tight groups. As she made her way to the nurses' station, Michelle noticed Dr. Johnson being escorted by security to the administration offices. Their eyes met briefly, and Michelle saw a mix of anger and fear in his face before he disappeared down the hall. "Michelle," a voice called. She turned to see Susan, one of the nurses who had always been distant toward her, walking over with a nervous smile. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't realize—" Susan began. Michelle nodded, accepting the apology, unsure of what to say. Before she could respond, an announcement came over the hospital's PA system. "All staff, please report to the main auditorium for an emergency meeting in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory." The auditorium was packed when Michelle arrived. She found a seat near the back, aware of the curious looks from her co-workers. Up front, Mr. Brown, now dressed in a suit despite the casts on his arms, stood speaking quietly with the hospital administrator and several other important-looking individuals. When the room quieted, Mr. Brown stepped up to the podium. His presence commanded attention, and the chatter immediately died down. "Good morning," he began, his voice strong. "For those who don't know me, I'm Wilson Browns, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've been here as a patient recovering from a skiing accident. During this time, I had the chance to observe the daily operations and culture of St. Martin's." He paused, scanning the room. What I saw was deeply concerning. I witnessed discrimination, bias, and unprofessional behavior, things that have no place in modern healthcare. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. "Let me be clear," Mr. Brown continued. The treatment of Nurse Michelle Garcia is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem that has been allowed to persist here for far too long. Michelle felt the weight of many eyes on her, but she held her head high. Mr. Brown laid out the changes that would take effect immediately. An investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and an overhaul of hiring and promotion procedures. And, he added, his tone growing stern, those found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. Ethan Johnson, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. Another wave of whispers filled the room. Michelle could see some of Dr. Johnson's supporters looking shocked and outraged, while others seemed relieved. Mr. Brown stood at the front of the room, addressing the staff. "I understand these changes might be tough for some of you," he said. "Change usually is. But let's be clear, this isn't just about doing the right thing morally. It's about providing the best care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace benefits everyone." As he wrapped up his speech, he made an announcement that took everyone by surprise. "Lastly, I'd like to introduce you to the person who will be leading many of these changes. Nurse Michelle Garcia has agreed to step into the role of Chief Diversity Officer here at St. Martin's. Her experiences and insights will be crucial as we work together to transform this hospital." Michelle felt a wave of emotions hit her: shock, pride, and nervousness, when the room burst into applause. She had no idea this was coming, as she'd only talked about joining the Diversity and Inclusion Committee with Mr. Brown. Walking up to the front at his gesture, Michelle noticed the mixed reactions from her co-workers. Some showed surprise, others respect, and a few still had a bit of resentment lingering in their eyes. Standing at the podium, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Brown. To all of you, I want to say this. I'm not standing here as an enemy. I'm here as a fellow colleague who believes in the potential of St. Martin's and everyone who works here. The road ahead won't be easy, but I'm dedicated to working with all of you to make this a hospital where every staff member feels appreciated and every patient receives the best care, no matter where they come from." As Michelle spoke, she could see the effect her words had on the room. Some of the staff nodded in agreement, while others seemed deep in thought. Even those who had been unfriendly before were listening carefully. The atmosphere at the hospital was changing. There was still some tension, but now there was a growing sense of hope and possibility. Throughout the day, Michelle worked alongside Mr. Brown and the rest of the hospital leadership to start putting the changes into motion. The work was draining, but exciting, and for the first time since she started at St. Martin's, Michelle felt like she was truly making a difference. That evening, as she was getting ready to leave, she found Mr. Brown waiting for her near the exit. "Nurse Garcia," he said with a warm smile. "Or should I say, Chief Diversity Officer Garcia. How are you feeling?" Michelle let out a tired laugh. "It's been quite a day." Mr. Brown nodded. "I get it. It's a lot to take in, but I want you to know I have complete confidence in your ability to lead these changes. Your strength and integrity are exactly what St. Martin's needs right now." As they walked out of the hospital together, Mr. Brown turned serious. "You should know this is just the beginning. What we're doing at St. Martin's, I plan to roll out across all of Healthcare United's facilities. Michelle, your story has the power to ignite a real change in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare." Michelle felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt empowered. "I'm ready for it," she said. "Together, we can make this change happen." As they went their separate ways, Michelle reflected on how much had shifted in just a few days. She had gone from feeling alone and almost ready to give up to leading a movement that could change not just St. Martin's, but the entire healthcare industry. The path ahead would be full of challenges, with obstacles and resistance from those against change. But as Michelle looked back at the hospital, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission. It was a chance to make sure no one else in healthcare had to go through what she had experienced. With a renewed sense of purpose, Michelle headed into the evening, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The transformation of St. Martin's had officially begun, marking the start of a new chapter in the fight for equality and inclusion in healthcare. In the months following Mr. Brown's unwavering support, the toxic environment at the hospital started to shift toward inclusivity and respect. The diversity and inclusion training, which many initially resisted, slowly began to change perspectives. Dr. Johnson, after a thorough investigation, was let go, sending a strong message that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated anymore. As the changes at St. Martin's gained attention, Michelle became a sought-after speaker at medical conferences and diversity seminars. 1 year after that pivotal day with Mr. Brown, Michelle found herself standing before a crowded auditorium at a national healthcare conference. "A year ago," she began, "I was a nurse on the verge of quitting. Today, I'm here to show you that change is real, and one voice truly can make a difference." She shared the story of St. Martin's transformation, not holding back about the difficulties they faced, but also celebrating the wins, the lives touched, the minds changed, and the culture shifted. After the conference, Mr. Brown, now fully recovered, approached her with a warm smile. "Michelle," he greeted, "you've come a long way since I met you a year ago." They talked about St. Martin's progress and how it was starting to influence other hospitals in the healthcare network. "You know, Michelle," Mr. Brown said, "when I was admitted to St. Martin's after my skiing accident, I never imagined the journey that would follow. You've not only changed St. Martin's, but reignited my passion for this work." As Michelle returned to St. Martin's, she reflected on her incredible journey, from being a frustrated and isolated nurse to becoming a leader and catalyst for change. The work was far from finished, but she felt more hopeful and determined than ever before. When she arrived, Susan, once a distant colleague, greeted her warmly, now an ally in their mission. The hospital buzzed with new energy. Staff members were working together and communicating in ways they never had before. In the main lobby, Michelle paused in front of a new mural showing a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. A plaque beneath it read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As she settled back into her office, ready to face new challenges, Michelle smiled. Transforming St. Martin's was just the start. The real work, changing hearts, minds, and entire systems, was still ahead, but she was more than ready for it. One day at a time, she would keep fighting for a healthcare system that was truly inclusive. What part of Michelle's story speaks to you the most? Was it her resilience in the face of adversity, or maybe Mr. Brown's surprising intervention? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked this story, consider subscribing to the channel. I put my heart into sharing these uplifting stories with you, and your support keeps me going. Thank you for being part of this journey.